everybody. This is Dr. John Morris, and I want to talk today about literary markers, devices inside the text we can use to divide the text into units and segments of meaning. I'm going to be using the Gospel of Mark today as an example, but we could be using anything. Now, the Bibles we have today are already divided. They have chapters and verses, and by and large, those chapters and verses are pretty good indications of the divisions. Many Bibles have paragraphs marked, and that's another indication of a literary division. So that if we want to study a passage, we can look at one particular paragraph and have a pretty good indication that we're dealing with one sense unit or one subject the author is talking about. But I think it's important to remember that those chapter and verse divisions are man-made. They're not inspired. And if we really want to look at the inspired divisions in Mark's Gospel, we have to look and see how Mark divided it. And we use these literary markers as a way to tell how Mark actually divided his text. And I'll give you an example of a problem with the modern chapters and verses. Normally when we start to preach chapter 5, the Gerasene demoniac story, we start with chapter 4:1. But we forget that when Mark wrote his gospel, he didn't have those chapter and verse divisions, and he ends chapter 4:1 with a question. Who is this guy that's doing these miracles in the Sea of Galilee? And then he immediately flows into chapter 5. Now, in the normal course of events, when someone asks a question, you expect to get an answer. And if you read Mark without those chapter and verse divisions, you get the question asked at the end of chapter 4, and you get the question answered at the beginning of chapter 5. So sometimes those chapter verses can work against us. So what is a literary marker? A literary marker is some piece of literary structure that the author uses to indicate either the beginning or the end of a particular sense passage or story or something like that. Now these structures may be time shifts from day to night or morning to evening, but it's an indication that clearly we're talking about a different time. So on another day, Jesus did something. That would be the indication of a start. Sometimes these are geographic markers. We're in Galilee and then we go to Jerusalem. Or even more importantly, we're on the road to Jerusalem. If we look at Mark 8, 9, and 10, Jesus is on the road, and Mark kind of sets that up. He actually uses a literary marker in this case, I think, of a healing of a blind person. So he has a healing of a blind person at the beginning of the road to Jerusalem, and he has a healing of a blind person at the end of the road to Jerusalem. Now that doesn't really have a lot to do with the chapter divisions, but Mark is kind of saying this is one literary unit. Now, if you remember the Markan sandwich, that's another indication that Mark is saying he started something, he interrupts it, and he finishes it, but that is one whole unit that may or may not bear a great relationship to the chapter and verse divisions. Other things you might want to think about are scene shifts. So if Jesus moves from inside to outside, that would be an indication of a literary marker, the beginning of a new segment. So there are lots of things that can do it. And I think if you start paying attention, they'll start popping out at you all over the place. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. If you look at Mark 4, verse 1, it says, he began to teach by the sea. And in that case, we have a sort of a time. He's beginning to do something, and we have a new location by the sea, and that would indicate the start of a literary marker or the start of a new story. And I think the man-made chapter divisions recognize that because that's chapter 4, verse 1. But then if you look at verse 4:10 in that same passage, it says, as soon as he was alone. So it's another kind of time or location or spatial indication that indicates, yes, we have this big story that started while he was teaching by the sea, but we've got another little piece of it here, and it's set off by that as soon as he began to teach. So you see how the literary markers can help you. Another good example is 3:1. It says he entered again into the synagogue. Again, the beginning of a chapter, so we kind of expect that. But we're looking at a new action, a new location, maybe even a new time based on what came before. And then, but you look at 3:20 and it says, and he came home. So in that same chapter, but clearly he's not in the synagogue anymore. He's moved into his home environment. He's moved from a public synagogue environment into a private home environment. So I hope you can see how these literary markers will help you identify a sense passage that may or may not be associated with the chapters and verses. I think it'll really help you pay attention to what Mark says is important and how Mark divides his story as opposed to how human beings do it. So I hope that helped, and I will see you around in the forums. So until next time, bye-bye.